Juliet Dane is 30 years old and a full colonel in the U.S. Army, but to her family, she's still the daughter who threw her life away by choosing military service over business school. Tomorrow, she'll sit across from her father and brother in a high-stakes defense contract meeting, and they have no idea she's the Pentagon liaison with final approval authority. Tonight, they'll talk over her like always. But tomorrow, when the CEO calls her Colonel Dane in front of the entire boardroom, their silence will say it all. This isn't a story of revenge. It's about a woman proving she never needed their validation to be enough. The driveway was narrower than I remembered. Back when I still lived here, my old dented sedan used to fit with room to spare. Now the black rental SUV I parked felt too large, too polished, like a visiting dignitary forced into a crumbling village street. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet hum of the cooling dashboard, feeling the silence settle. Military calm, they called it. Dry palms? Controlled breath, eyes steady. But my stomach still twisted the way it did before deployment, a taut wire vibrating under my ribs. I glanced at the porch light, same warm, yellow glow illuminating the chipped welcome mat with the faded cursive "Home Sweet Home." The door still had a thin crack along its bottom edge, the wood swollen from decades of Midwestern rain. Nothing had changed here. Not the cracked steps, not the brittle brown hedges lining the walk, not the feeling that pressed down on my chest every time I crossed this threshold. That feeling of being both invisible and scrutinized, of walking into a place that never really saw me and yet dissected every choice I made. I rang the doorbell out of habit. Juliet, my mother, called from the kitchen, her voice floating through the hall, thin and distracted. She didn't come to the door. It's open. Of course it was. I pushed it open, stepped inside, and let the familiar scent hit me, a cloying blend of lavender potpourri and stale pot roast, like stepping into a sealed time capsule. The walls of the front hall were lined with framed photos, every inch carefully curated: Logan's college graduation, Logan's wedding, Logan's son sitting in pumpkin patches, and Santa laps, each photo commemorated in gold-trimmed frames. There were no photos of me. Not in uniform, not at basic training graduation, not even the commissioning portrait I had mailed them 5 years ago with a handwritten note saying, "Thought you might want this for the hallway." They hadn't wanted it. I walked toward the kitchen, my boots silent on the scuffed hardwood floors. My mother stood at the stove stirring a pot of gravy, her gray-streaked hair twisted up in a neat bun. She didn't look up when I entered. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, her tone brisk and bright in the way someone talks about the weather. "Logan and Mariel are on their way. Logan just got another promotion. You'll never believe it." "That's great, Mom," I said softly. "You'll have to congratulate him," she continued, finally glancing at me with a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "He's leading the entire systems integration team now. Everyone at your father's company says he's going places." Going places. That phrase used to gut me. It always sounded like a train I'd missed and could never catch each mile it sped ahead, cementing how far behind I'd fallen. Now it was just noise like static on an old radio. Because in this house it didn't matter where I went or what I achieved. I would always be the daughter who chose wrong. I stepped into the dining room. The table was set for 6 polished silverware gleaming under the old chandelier. There were no name cards, but the seating was implied and unspoken: Logan at the head, Dad on his right, Mom between them and me somewhere. Floating at the fringe like a placeholder, nobody knew what to do with. The front door opened precisely on time. Logan walked in wearing a tailored blazer and that faint cologne that cost more than my first month's salary. He hugged me quickly, eyes already drifting past my shoulder to search for Dad. "Hey, Jules." "Long time." "5 years," I replied. He paused, clearly unsure if I was joking. I wasn't. His wife Mariel followed behind carrying a bottle of wine none of us would actually enjoy, but everyone would pretend to appreciate. She air-kissed my cheek with the efficiency of someone checking a social obligation off her list. Dinner was roast beef with mashed potatoes and the same iceberg lettuce salad my mother had served since I was 10. Logan held court effortlessly, describing corporate restructures, leadership retreats, and his new military project with confident, sweeping gestures. Dad's eyes glistened with pride every time Logan spoke. Mom refilled his water glass twice without being asked. It was like watching a kingdom toast its rightful heir. "And you," my mother asked, turning to me with that polite, empty smile, "still traveling with the Army?" "More or less," I said, taking a sip of water. "Still a captain?" Dad asked, eyes never leaving his plate. "Something like that," I replied. "Must be tough being in the field all the time," Logan added. "No long-term strategy, right? Just following orders." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Upstairs, folded with ritual precision in the back of my suitcase, was my midnight blue uniform. The silver eagle insignia on its shoulders gleamed even in dim hotel light. It was the rank they thought I would never achieve, the symbol of a career they considered wasted potential. I sat through the rest of dinner, nodding in the right places, smiling at Logan's anecdotes about quarterly targets and performance bonuses, listening to my mother laugh at jokes that weren't funny. My father barely looked at me. When he did, it was only to assess, as if trying to understand where exactly I'd gone wrong. That night, after dishes were cleared and Logan left with promises to email his new strategic plan to Dad, I sat on the edge of my old twin bed. The patchwork quilt my grandmother sewed when I was 12 still covered it, faded pinks and blues worn soft by time. The walls around me were lined with relics from a version of me they had once believed in: basketball trophies, honor roll certificates, acceptance letters to colleges I never attended. Every accomplishment prior to the moment I chose to accept ROTC scholarship instead of a business school track. After that, I became a cautionary tale in this house. There were no framed articles about my cybersecurity awards, no photos from my deployments, no certificates marking my promotions to major, then lieutenant colonel, then full colonel at 30. The most significant achievement of my life was completely invisible here. And tomorrow at Oro 900, I would walk into Westbridge Technologies in full uniform, brief the executive board as Pentagon liaison for Project Sentinel, and evaluate the same technical strategy Logan bragged about over mashed potatoes. For tonight, though, I let them have their illusions. Because tomorrow, when the CEO called me Colonel Dane in front of that boardroom, their silence would say everything I didn't need to. At dawn, the sky outside my childhood window was the color of bruised steel streaked faintly with gold where sunlight tried to force its way through. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed back straight, staring at the uniform folded carefully across my knees. Midnight blue fabric pressed until every crease was razor sharp. Rows of ribbons gleamed under the warm lamplight, the silver eagle insignia catching each shifting ray. I ran a soft cloth over the polished buttons, removing invisible fingerprints. My hands moved with mechanical precision, ritual over emotion. This was how I calmed myself before every mission briefing, every cyber strategy summit that could alter national security for decades to come. This uniform had walked me through classified war rooms and black site operations. It had witnessed the worst and the best of me. Today, it would become my armor again. Downstairs, the sounds of early morning life drifted up through the thin floorboards, my mother's footsteps crossing the kitchen tiles, the kettle whistling faintly before she lifted it off the stove, the muted clatter of my father's coffee spoon against porcelain. Logan's voice carried clearly even from here, confident, energetic, already mid-call with a colleague. "So we'll finalize the rollout strategy before Colonel whatever her name is gets on the line," he said. "We want to look tight. We want Pentagon eyes on us for Phase 3. I smiled without humor. "Colonel whatever her name is." He didn't even bother learning who would approve his entire future. That had always been Logan, assuming his world was the only one that mattered, confident everyone else orbited around his gravity. I reached for the insignia pin and attached it to my shoulder epaulette. The metal was cold against my skin, heavy with meaning. Lieutenant Colonel at 28, full colonel at 30, awards, citations, commendations tucked away in Pentagon records, all invisible in this house. Here I was, still the girl who quit business school, the daughter who threw away her potential to crawl in desert sand beside men twice her age. I stood and pulled the uniform jacket over my shoulders. The fabric molded perfectly to my posture, its weight pressing me into a calm readiness. My hair was pulled into a tight bun at the nape of my neck, no stray wisps. I checked myself in the small mirror above my childhood dresser. The reflection staring back at me was not the girl who once taped college acceptance letters to that wall. She was something harder, steadier, a woman who had fought for every ounce of respect she carried. I gathered my cover and briefcase and headed downstairs. My mother stood at the sink, washing Logan's favorite travel mug. She turned when she heard my footsteps, her eyes falling to the silver eagle pinned to my shoulder. For a moment, her lips parted as if she might say something, ask something, anything. But instead, she looked back at the mug scrubbing harder. Leaving early, she asked, her voice clipped as though casual conversation was safer than acknowledging what she saw. "I have somewhere important to be," I replied evenly. She didn't ask where. She never did. My father sat at the kitchen table reading the business section of the morning paper, glasses perched low on his nose. He didn't even glance up. "Don't be late for dinner," he muttered, flipping the page with a flick of his wrist. "I won't," I said, though we both knew that tonight everything would change. I paused by the doorway, letting my eyes drift over this house one last time. The fridge covered in magnets from Logan's conferences, the dry flowers in a chipped vase, the ceiling fan that clicked with every slow rotation. For years I had tried to earn a place here, to force them to see my worth through the narrow slats of their expectations. Today I felt nothing, no ache, no bitterness, just calm certainty. Outside, the air was brisk, the early sun barely warming the dew-slick driveway. I walked to the SUV and opened the back to set my briefcase inside. For a moment, I simply stood there watching faint contrails slice the sky overhead. Somewhere another deployment flight was taking off. Another young lieutenant was hugging her mother goodbye. Another father was telling his son to come back with honor. But no one had told me that when I left for basic training. My father's parting words were, "Don't call us when you change your mind." And my mother had just stood by the window, arms folded, as I walked down this same driveway, carrying a duffel bag that weighed almost as much as I did. I shook the memory away. That was a lifetime ago. I closed the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and adjusted the mirror. The face staring back at me was calm, composed, unflinching. I started the engine and backed down the driveway gravel, crunching under the tires like a muted drum roll. Today I wasn't just driving to a meeting. I was crossing into the battlefield where every unspoken insult, every dismissal, every time they looked past me would be met with quiet, irrefutable proof. Because in a few hours I would walk into Westbridge Technologies not as Juliet the Disappointment, but as Colonel Juliet Dane, Pentagon Liaison and final authority on Project Sentinel, the most lucrative defense contract of their careers. They wouldn't see it coming, but they would see me. And whether they were ready or not, everything was about to change. The drive to Westbridge Technologies should have taken 40 minutes, but I arrived in just under 30. The roads were empty, bathed in the pale gold of early morning. I parked in a reserved spot marked DoD Authorized Military Liaison and killed the engine. For a moment, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, feeling my pulse drum against my palms. Outside, suited employees streamed toward the glass entrance, clutching coffee cups and messenger bags, tapping their badges against security scanners with robotic efficiency. Their movements were precise, practiced people who believed they knew exactly how the world worked. People like my father, like Logan. I could already hear their voices in my head. What is she doing here? That's Juliet, right? The one who joined the army? I thought she was just a captain or something. The familiar tightness coiled in my chest, a deep ache that felt like shame but wasn't. It was anger. It was grief. It was the echo of every time I'd walked into this building for family events wearing civilian clothes, ignored by my father's colleagues as they congratulated Logan on another internship, another executive training rotation, another title he'd done little to earn. I looked down at my uniform. The Silver Eagle insignia caught the morning light, reflecting onto the dashboard like a silent affirmation. Full Colonel U.S. Army Cyber Command, the youngest in my cohort, the only woman. The officer trusted to oversee Project Sentinel, the program these men spent decades lobbying for. But even then, doubt flickered at the edge of my resolve. A small, traitorous voice whispered, "Maybe you don't belong here. Maybe this is their world, not yours." My stomach churned the way it did before deployment flights right after briefing, but before wheels up when there was nothing left to do but wait and wonder if everything you prepared for was enough. In war, fear kept you alive. In this world, fear kept you small, hidden, forgotten. I exhaled slowly, fighting the instinct to turn the key back and drive away. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to call the Pentagon office, tell them something had come up, ask a subordinate to attend in my place. Let Logan keep thinking his world was unassailable. Let my father keep believing I'd thrown my life away, because what was the point of proving anything to people who never really saw me in the first place? I closed my eyes and let the memory wash over me the last time I'd sat paralyzed in a car like this. 5 years ago, outside Fort Gordon, the day I was promoted to captain. I just called home breathless with pride, hoping for something. Anything. "Captain," my father had said, his tone flat. "Is that supposed to impress me?" After that, I stopped calling. The memory burned hot behind my eyelids, sharper than any battlefield scar. I opened my eyes and looked down at my hands. They weren't trembling. They were steady fingers curled with calm strength. Military calm. You've led missions that protected an entire nation's networks from collapse, I reminded myself. You've briefed 4-star generals and cabinet officials without flinching. You can walk into a corporate boardroom. And yet the fear was still there. Not fear of failure. Fear of them. Of their disappointment, their dismissal, their inability to see beyond the narrow blueprint they had written for my life. For a brief moment, I imagined turning the car around, driving back to my hotel, changing into jeans and a sweater, flying back to DC tomorrow, letting them keep their illusions forever, because it would be easier. It would always be easier to stay unseen. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, eyes closed, letting the hum of distant traffic and morning bird song anchor me. Then I straightened, adjusted my collar, checked my insignia one last time. Easy was never why I chose this path. I stepped out of the SUV, boots hitting the asphalt with solid certainty. The morning breeze caught the edge of my uniform jacket, lifting it slightly, like a silent salute. Around me, employees slowed, staring at the eagle insignia, at the rows of ribbons, at the posture that said, "I belong here, whether you understand it or not." The doubt didn't vanish, but it quieted. Because courage wasn't the absence of fear. Courage was walking forward despite it. And so with every step toward the glass doors of Westbridge Technologies, I left behind the girl who sought their approval. Today I wasn't here to prove myself. I was here to do my job. The elevator hummed softly as it rose, a steady vibration beneath my boots. I stood in full uniform facing the mirrored doors, watching my own reflection with an unsettling sense of detachment. Midnight blue jacket pressed to perfection, ribbons aligned in 2 clean rows, silver eagle insignia gleaming under fluorescent lights. The woman looking back at me looked calm, unbreakable, but beneath the polished steel of discipline, my chest felt tight with an old familiar ache. My father's voice rang in my mind like a curse I could never scrub out. The military is for people with no real potential. Captain, is that supposed to impress me? Come home and do something meaningful with your life. I exhaled, forcing the memories back. It didn't matter what he thought anymore. It shouldn't matter. But it did. Even now, standing in this elevator, knowing I was about to walk into that boardroom with authority, none of them could challenge part of me, still felt like the girl who packed her duffel bag at 17 and left without looking back, heart bruised from his disappointment. The elevator chimed as it passed the 10th floor. The polished doors reflected my insignia in warped silver. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered at the edges of my focus, cold and biting. What if you don't belong here? What if you're just a soldier trying to play corporate games you'll never win, and then cutting through the static of self-doubt like a clear radio transmission in a combat zone? I heard a voice. Calm, firm, unyielding. Dane, what do you see when you look in the mirror? I closed my eyes, the elevator continuing its silent climb. I could almost feel the desert heat again, the smell of dust and metal seared into canvas tents, the electric tension of command. Colonel Reyes, my 1st Battalion commander, the man who taught me everything about leadership they'd never teach in Westbridge boardrooms. I was 23 the day he asked me that question. I'd just completed my first major cyber breach containment as a junior officer. A hostile intrusion traced to a foreign intelligence cell neutralized in less than 12 hours. I'd barely slept. My uniform was rumpled from 48 hours straight in the command tent. When I'd stepped into his office for the post-operation debrief, I expected congratulations. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, dark eyes studying me with unsettling intensity. What do you see when you look in the mirror, Dane? I swallowed, unsure. A good officer, sir. Someone who handled it. He shook his head slowly. No. Look deeper. I shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. I see someone trying to be good enough. His eyes narrowed, then softened with something I rarely saw in him, compassion. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk. Rank gives you authority. Competence gives you trust. But worth, he paused. Worth is what you decide it is. You think these men will ever tell you you're enough? They won't. Not in the Army, not outside it. You can spend your entire life trying to earn their approval, or you can realize right now you don't need it. Because worth isn't given, it's built. Every decision, every failure, every mission, every promotion, brick by brick until no one can tear it down but you. I remember nodding then, not fully understanding adrenaline still crashing through my veins. But in the years since, in quiet deployment tents, under bare bulbs, in Pentagon war rooms lit by floor-to-ceiling monitors, in sterile hotels before classified briefings, his words became my anchor. My mentor wasn't a single man anymore. It was the discipline he instilled. The philosophy that worth is self-defined, that leadership is presence over pride, and that the strongest people never need validation to stand firm. The elevator chimed again. My eyes opened. Presence over revenge, precision over pride, I heard him say again deep in my mind. True command is never about making them see you. It's knowing you'll lead whether they do or not. The elevator doors slid open onto the executive floor. Plush navy carpet, frosted glass conference rooms, abstract art lining the hallway pieces I had memorized weeks ago in the building schematics. No surprises, no hesitation. I stepped out, boots sinking silently into expensive carpet. Ahead, Logan stood by the window, flipping through his tablet, presentation posture relaxed and confident. My father's voice drifted down the hallway in deep measured tones as he spoke, with two men in tailored suits, gesturing with authority that once ruled my entire world. For a fleeting second, fear rose in my chest. That girl inside me wanted to turn around to run back to the elevator and disappear, to let them keep their illusions, to stay small so I didn't risk the crushing weight of their disappointment again. But Colonel Reyes's words wrapped around my spine like armor. Don't confuse rank with worth, Dane. Worth comes from what you build when no one is watching. I straightened my cover under my arm, adjusted my insignia, and walked forward. Colonel Reyes wasn't here, but his discipline, his unwavering belief in silent leadership walked beside me now. Today wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about forcing my father to see me. Today was about presence, precision, performance. Because leadership wasn't them seeing me. It was knowing I didn't need them to. And with every step toward that conference room, I carried my mentor with me, the man who taught me the truth I would live by for the rest of my life. You are already enough. Now go prove it to yourself. The hallway outside the executive boardroom was silent, except for the soft hum of the HVAC system. I stood at the far end, adjusting my cover under my arm, taking in the scene before stepping in. Through the glass walls, I saw them all directors in tailored suits, reviewing printed decks, project leads hunched over sleek laptops, assistants arranging bottled water, and brushed steel carafes along a linen-covered side table. The low murmur of confident conversation drifted into the hallway, punctuated by quiet laughs from men who believed today was another routine victory. My brother stood by the windows overlooking the city skyline, his back-straight tablet in hand, scrolling with the brisk, sure flicks of someone certain he belonged. He wore a slate-gray blazer and expensive leather shoes that gleamed under recessed lights. The sun caught the side of his face, illuminating his sharp jawline, his easy corporate haircut. To everyone in this room, he was the golden boy, the heir apparent to my father's throne. He hadn't seen me yet. I watched him for a moment, feeling a strange ache settle deep in my chest. Not envy, not regret, just an old familiar sadness. The quiet grief of a child who spent years trying to be seen by someone who was never looking in her direction. I adjusted my insignia pin, feeling its cool weight against my shoulder, and stepped forward. The carpet swallowed the sound of my boots, but head still turned as I walked past. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Eyes flicked down to my uniform and widened subtly, taking in the rows of ribbons, the silver eagle insignia, the quiet authority in my posture. Some people straightened unconsciously, as if their bodies recognized hierarchy before their minds caught up. Juliet Logan's voice cut across the room like a blade sharp with confusion. He turned, brows drawn together. His gaze traveled over my uniform, slowly registering every detail, the polished buttons, the carefully aligned ribbons, the Pentagon badge clipped to my belt. What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low, almost embarrassed. "And why are you dressed like that?" I didn't answer. I kept walking each step, smooth and deliberate, until I reached the conference table. My father appeared from a cluster of men near the projection screen, his words fading into silence when he saw me. His eyes moved over me in disbelief, narrowing slightly, as though trying to decode what he was seeing. "Juliet," he said, his voice edged with irritation. "What is going on? Why are you wearing that?" This isn't before he could finish, a woman's voice rose behind him. "Colonel Dane." The entire room shifted as Lorraine Hart, CEO of Westbridge Technologies, stepped forward with swift confidence. She wore a navy pantsuit that matched the corporate palette perfectly, her cropped white hair framing sharp cheekbones. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. "I didn't realize you'd be attending in person today," she said, extending her hand with genuine warmth. "It's an honor to have you here." I took her hand firmly, feeling every executive in the room watch the exchange with rapt attention. "I was in the area," I replied calmly. "I thought it would be useful to sit in on the briefing myself." "Absolutely," Lorraine said, turning to the room with the commanding ease of someone used to being obeyed. "Everyone, if you haven't had the pleasure, this is Colonel Juliet Dane, our Pentagon liaison for Project Sentinel. She has final approval authority for all military integrations on this contract." The shift in the room was instantaneous and visceral. Conversations died. Tablets were set down. The air itself seemed to tighten with a silent, collective recalibration. My father's mouth opened slightly, then closed again as he looked around, gauging the sudden ripple of deference moving through the boardroom. Logan's face blanched. His hands tightened around his tablet until his knuckles turned white. Lorraine gestured to the head of the table where my name placard was already placed, COL Juliet Dane, in bold black letters above the Department of Defense seal. I placed my cover and briefcase carefully beside it, slid the chair back, and sat down, spine-straight, boots planted firmly on the carpet. I felt the weight of every gaze settle on me, surprise, confusion, curiosity, and something deeper, recognition. The kind that couldn't be undone. Across the polished mahogany table, Logan remained standing, frozen in place. He looked like a man who had walked into a room expecting a coronation and found a tribunal instead. My father slowly sank into his seat, eyes locked on mine, his expression a tangled web of shock pride and a wounded kind of disbelief. I folded my hands calmly on the table, letting the silence settle around me like armor. Because this was it. This was the threshold I had trained for my entire life. Not a battlefield in Kandahar, not a cyber breach containment in Ramstein, not a Pentagon strategy summit. This, walking into a room full of people who built their lives believing I was small and powerless and showing them the truth without saying a word. Lorraine began the meeting, welcoming everyone and thanking me again for my presence. I nodded politely, my eyes scanning the room with quiet precision. Engineers, directors, program leads each introduced themselves to me with the careful politeness reserved for people who could stall or greenlight millions in funding. Some looked surprised I was so young. Most were surprised I was a woman. But none asked twice once they saw the insignia. At the far end of the table, my father cleared his throat softly, his eyes fixed on the agenda in front of him, as though hoping it would erase this moment. But nothing could, because crossing this threshold wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliating them. It wasn't even about validation. It was about presence, precision, performance, about stepping fully into the person I had become in a language they could neither interrupt nor belittle. I sat back slightly, feeling my heartbeat slow to its mission rhythm, steady, unbreakable, unafraid. Because today, they would finally see me. And whether they were ready or not, everything was about to change. The meeting began with a formality that felt almost ceremonial. Lorraine opened the session with a short address about national security innovation and Westbridge's commitment to excellence. Her voice was steady and polished, practiced to command rooms like this. But even she glanced at me periodically, as if gauging my reactions to each line. Because everyone knew the truth now, no decision today would move forward without my approval. I flipped open my leather-bound briefing folder, scanning the first set of slides as they projected onto the main screen. Project Sentinel, Phase 2, Rollout. Proposed integration of tactical AI modules into existing defense networks. It was impressive on paper, structured, optimized, streamlined, but I had seen what happened when structured efficiency ignored operational reality. I had seen lives lost because someone in a boardroom didn't think beyond their metrics. Colonel Dane Lorraine said, breaking my concentration, I'd like to begin with an overview from Logan Dane, our systems integration lead. Logan stood quickly, his chair scraping lightly against the carpet. He cleared his throat, flipping to his notes on the tablet. His hands trembled just slightly, but his voice came out smooth and confident, the corporate polish that had always made my father proud. "Thank you, Miss Hart," he began. "As systems integration lead, I've been developing a phased rollout strategy to ensure all tactical modules align with current cybersecurity protocols while maintaining operational adaptability." I watched him as he spoke, detailing resource allocations, subcontractor timelines, and integration milestones. The words flowed effortlessly, a performance honed over years of investor presentations and internal executive reviews. But beneath the jargon, I heard the gaps, the blind spots, the decisions that sounded strong in a slide deck but would fail under cyber combat pressure. He finished with a rehearsed smile, turning toward me. "I believe this approach will keep us within performance targets while demonstrating readiness to pivot when the Pentagon provides final technical specifications." I closed my folder, meeting his gaze calmly. "Mr. Dane?" I said, my voice neutral and measured. "Could you clarify how your proposed method accounts for the latency threshold specified in the last Pentagon memo?" He blinked rapidly. I can revisit that portion." "You'll need to?" I replied evenly. "Our benchmarks are non-negotiable. Latency above 35 ms will compromise real-time defensive countermeasures. Please revise the protocol draft and submit it by close of business Thursday." A flicker of anger crossed his face before he forced a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am." Around the table, executives shifted subtly, reassessing the power dynamic with silent precision. Logan sat down slowly, staring at his notes with a clenched jaw. The next presenter was Dr. Eleanor Price, Westbridge's chief cyber architect. She adjusted her glasses as she began outlining new encryption frameworks for Sentinel's AI learning modules. Her voice was calm, steady, and unpretentious. As she spoke, she glanced at me occasionally, not with defensiveness, but with curiosity, as if she genuinely welcomed critique to refine her team's work. When she finished, I nodded. "Your approach to layered encryption is solid. I recommend expanding the entropy pool parameters for Module 3 to avoid the predictability inherent in standard pseudo-random number generation." Her eyes lit up, and she nodded enthusiastically. "Agreed. We're running entropy tests now. I'll include updated results in the next memo." There it was, an ally, someone focused on mission success over ego, someone who saw me not as an adversary, but as a resource. I made a mental note to follow up with her team later. Allies in rooms like this were rare. Allies who were also competent were invaluable. The next hour unfolded in a blur of acronyms, budget justifications, and strategic slides filled with arrows and circles. Some presenters spoke with tight shoulders and forced smiles, their fear of me outweighing their belief in their own work. Others, mostly engineers and systems architects, spoke with quiet confidence, offering clear explanations when I pressed for clarifications. Then came Gregory Hale, the VP of Corporate Strategy, my father's protege for almost 2 decades. He stood with casual arrogance, buttoning his suit jacket as he launched into a sweeping proposal about expanded contractor networks, projected savings, and how our friends at the Pentagon would surely appreciate cost efficiencies. He didn't look at me once, only at my father, who watched him with faint approval. When he finished, I let the silence stretch. The room shifted uncomfortably. Finally, he glanced at me with thinly veiled annoyance. "Colonel Dane," he said, his tone syrupy and condescending, "I trust this aligns with your understanding of current DoD procurement expectations." I folded my hands, studying him. "No, Mr. Hale, it does not." The blood drained from his face. I continued calmly. "Your approach demonstrates neither technical understanding of operational demands nor any awareness of current defense acquisition university procurement revisions." I suggest you spend less time projecting hypothetical savings and more time understanding the regulations you're attempting to bypass. His jaw tightened. Of course, Colonel. Across the table, I saw my father shift slightly in his seat, his expression unreadable. For a brief second, his eyes met mine. There was no pride there, nor was there contempt. There was only recognition, a dawning awareness of the weight I carried, of what I had built far beyond the walls of his company. Lorraine moved the meeting forward swiftly, her respect for my input clear in every transition. The team continued presenting. I asked questions. I challenged assumptions. I made note of what was solid and what would crumble under real-world strain. Each interaction tested them and tested me. Every dismissive glance, every defensive rebuttal, every respectful nod was a data point in this battlefield of words and posture. And as the hours passed, one truth settled deeper in my chest with quiet finality. This was my domain now. They were no longer evaluating me. I was evaluating them. The meeting broke for a brief recess just after noon. Lorraine called a 10-minute break before reconvening for final approval decisions. Executives stood and stretched stiff shoulders, murmuring to each other in low voices. The room buzzed with an undercurrent of shifting power dynamics. Some approached me quietly to thank me for my feedback. Others avoided eye contact altogether. I stood and gathered my notes methodically, stacking briefing papers into my leather folder. The view from the glass conference wall stretched out across the city skyline, sunlit high rises, the pale blue arc of the river winding through concrete and glass. From here, it all looked orderly, contained, manageable. Colonel Dane. I turned to see Dr. Eleanor Price standing beside me, her glasses pushed up into her hairline as she wiped her lenses with a cloth. I just wanted to say, she began softly, thank you for the clarity today. We don't always get that kind of direct operational perspective. It helps. I studied her for a moment. Mid-40s, streaks of gray at her temples, a posture that radiated both exhaustion and resolve. A woman used to fighting quiet battles no one noticed. I inclined my head slightly. Your encryption framework is solid. If you integrate the entropy revision, Sentinel's AI modules will be resilient against quantum decryption threats for at least 2 operational cycles. Her eyes widened with faint relief and gratitude. That's what I hoped. I'll update the memo for your team this week. She hesitated, then added quietly, they didn't expect you to come today. No, I said, glancing across the room where Logan stood with 2 directors, his voice tight, his gestures sharper than before. They didn't. Dr. Price nodded as if she understood a deeper truth in my answer, then stepped away to refill her coffee. I watched her go, feeling a flicker of warmth in my chest, an ally in the cave, a quiet reminder that this battle wasn't just mine. I walked to the window, resting one gloved hand against the cool glass. My reflection merged with the city beyond Colonel insignia, gleaming faintly against skyscrapers blurred by distance. For a moment, I let my eyes close. This was the cave, the darkest part of the journey, the place where old wounds whispered the loudest. I could hear them now, soft and cruel. You're wasting your potential. The military is for people with no real options. Come home and do something meaningful. I remembered the day I told my father about the ROTC scholarship. I had expected hesitation. I hadn't expected disgust. The way he looked at me then, a mix of disappointment and disdain branded itself onto my bones. You were always meant for more, he had said. An MBA, a corner office, under my wing. As if the life I chose was a betrayal of the future he had written for me. Behind me, the boardroom bustled with quiet chaos. Coffee poured, slide decks rechecked. Logan's voice drifted louder as he spoke with forced levity about managing up with the Pentagon lady. I felt the old anger rise hot in my chest. The Pentagon lady, They still didn't see it. They still didn't see me. My mind drifted back to deployment nights under desert stars, staring up at the Milky Way while drones buzzed overhead. Back then, fear had a different shape, shaped like IEDs buried beneath dusty roads, like zero-day exploits seeded into military networks by silent foreign enemies. Out there, I learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the quiet decision to act anyway. I opened my eyes and studied my reflection again. The woman staring back at me wasn't the girl who left this city 5 years ago with trembling hands and a silent scream trapped in her chest. She was someone forged in battlefields both kinetic and cyber. Someone who had sat across from generals, counterintelligence directors, and federal secretaries, briefing them with a steady voice and absolute competence. And yet here in this cave, the deepest cave of all the ghosts of family shame still clawed at my ribs. Behind me, the door opened, and I saw Lorraine returning with 2 senior directors. Her eyes met mine, assessing, calculating, respectful. "Colonel Dane," she said, her voice crisp. "We're ready to reconvene when you are." I nodded, turning back to the room. As I walked to my seat, I passed Logan. He didn't meet my gaze. His shoulders were tense, jaw-locked eyes fixed on the floor. For a brief second, I almost felt pity. Almost. Because today wasn't about pity, or revenge, or even redemption. Today was about walking into this cave, this place of old wounds and silent dismissals, and standing unflinching in the darkness. Not to defeat them, but to prove to myself that I could. I sat down, placing my folder neatly before me, folding my hands with deliberate calm. Around the table, executives settled into their chairs, project leads pulled up their presentations, assistants whispered last-minute reminders. Lorraine took her seat beside mine, glancing at me with quiet certainty. "Shall we begin?" I met her gaze evenly, my voice low but unwavering. "Let's." Because I wasn't here to ask for a seat at their table. I was the table, and it was time they understood that. The meeting resumed with a new electric tension humming beneath the polished professionalism. Lorraine called the session to order, her voice carrying easily across the long table. Before we proceed to final approval, she said, "Colonel Dane has requested to brief the room on current operational benchmarks and integration expectations." She gestured toward me. The room quieted instantly. I rose, sliding my briefing folder to the side. My boots planted firmly on the carpet, my spine straight. As I scanned the rows of executives, engineers, and program leads, I felt a calm settle over me. The same calm I felt in war rooms before zero-hour deployment, when decisions meant lives saved or lost. "Thank you, Miss Hart." I began, my voice measured, carrying clearly to the far end of the conference room. Project Sentinel is a strategic cyber defense initiative under direct Pentagon oversight. Its success will determine not only the operational readiness of next-generation AI modules, but also the security of integrated NATO networks. I paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. "Your current milestones are commendable." I continued, flipping to my internal memo. "However, there are critical technical gaps that must be addressed before Phase 2 funding is released." I outlined them efficiently. Latency thresholds, encryption entropy pools, fail-safe redundancies, quantum decryption countermeasures. My words cut through the room like a scalpel. This wasn't grandstanding or corporate jargon, it was operational reality. The difference between an unbreachable system and one that would collapse under hostile infiltration within minutes. As I spoke, I saw Logan shift in his seat, his confident facade flickering with every specification he hadn't accounted for. My father sat rigid beside him, his gaze fixed firmly on the table. Neither interrupted, neither dared to. Finally, I said, "Closing my folder integration proposals must include adaptive tactical feedback protocols. Static rollout strategies will fail under dynamic cyber combat conditions. I expect revised drafts reflecting these requirements by COB Thursday." I sat down. The room remained silent for a long, heavy moment. Lorraine broke it with a crisp nod. "Thank you, Colonel." That was illuminating. She turned to the table. "Logan, please proceed with your rollout strategy presentation." I watched as my brother stood slowly, his posture stiffer than before. His tablet trembled slightly in his grip as he flipped to his slides. His voice came out tight but controlled. As systems integration lead, he began, "I've been developing a phased approach that aligns with current performance targets and projected budget constraints." He launched into his proposal. Graphs, metrics, flow charts. From an outside perspective, it was flawless. But I could hear the uncertainty threaded beneath his practiced cadence, the faltering edge to his confidence, the quiet desperation in his gaze each time it flicked toward me, searching for approval he didn't know how to earn. When he finished, silence fell. Lorraine turned to me. "Colonel Dane." I leaned back slightly, folding my hands over my folder. "Mr. Dane," I said, my tone neutral, professional, unyielding. "Your strategy is structurally efficient, but operationally unsound. Latency thresholds remain unaddressed, adaptive feedback protocols are absent, and your subcontractor resource allocations violate DoD procurement sequencing." He blinked rapidly, swallowing hard. "I can revisit those portions." "You will need to," I replied, holding his gaze steadily. "These benchmarks are non-negotiable. Submit a revised draft by Thursday. Ensure technical appendices include supporting documentation for all proposed adjustments." His shoulders slumped just slightly. "Yes, ma'am." For a brief second, I saw him not the corporate prince, not the golden son, but just a man. My brother. A boy raised to believe his worth was guaranteed, now standing before a reality he didn't know how to navigate. But there was no time for pity, because this was the ordeal. The crucible that would either forge him stronger or shatter his illusions forever. Lorraine moved the meeting forward. Other directors presented remaining integration modules. I asked questions, pressed for clarifications, approved what met operational requirements without hesitation. Each exchange layered the unspoken truth deeper into the room. I was not here to seek their validation. I was here because I was the authority. Finally, Lorraine called for final remarks. She turned to me, her eyes bright with hard-earned respect. "Colonel Dane, any closing comments?" I stood once more scanning the room. Every pair of eyes watched me, some with apprehension, some with guarded curiosity, a few with the flicker of genuine admiration, but none with dismissal. Not anymore. "This project has the potential to define the future of integrated cyber warfare defense," I said evenly. "Excellence is not optional. Your technical strategy will save lives or cost them. I expect you to approach your revisions with that reality in mind." I let silence settle again. The old part of me, the girl desperate for her father's approval, the cadet trembling under dismissive family glances, felt strangely quiet now, like a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. "Thank you for your time," I finished, inclining my head slightly. Lorraine rose immediately. "Thank you, Colonel. Your oversight is invaluable." The meeting adjourned, chairs scraped back, executives filed out, whispering to assistants, scribbling notes about revisions and deadlines. Logan remained seated, staring at his tablet. My father stood slowly watching me with an expression I couldn't read, something like pride tangled with regret and disbelief. I gathered my notes, calmly tucking them into my folder with deliberate precision. As I slipped my cover under my arm, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. This was the ordeal, the hardest battle, not because they challenged me, but because I walked into the cave of my deepest wounds and stood unflinching, holding my ground with quiet, irrefutable truth. As I turned to leave, Lorraine's voice called after me. "Colonel Dane," she said, smiling faintly, "you've elevated this team just by being here." I nodded once. That's what I'm here for. Because leadership wasn't about commanding the room. It was about walking into the darkest place you feared most and standing calmly in the fire until it burned away everything that wasn't real. The sun had dipped low by the time I stepped out of Westbridge Technologies. The city skyline burned gold and copper skyscrapers, casting long shadows over silent streets below. I paused just outside the glass doors, the cool evening air brushing against my flushed skin. For a moment, I stood still, letting the reality of what had just happened settle over me like a quiet tide. I had walked into the darkest cave of my life, the place haunted by old wounds, unspoken dismissals, silent judgments, and I hadn't just survived it. I had commanded it. As I crossed the parking lot toward my black SUV, employees still filtered out in small clusters, their voices lowered with a new reverence. Some nodded respectfully as I passed, others shifted aside their gazes, flicking to the eagle insignia on my shoulder with quiet recognition. Not curiosity, not surprise, recognition. The difference tasted like clean water after years in the desert. I climbed into the SUV, shut the door, and exhaled slowly. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked different somehow, not harder, not colder, just truer. The woman staring back at me wasn't seeking approval anymore. She wasn't yearning to be seen. She was seen. And even if she hadn't been, she knew now that she would have kept going anyway. I drove back to my hotel through silent streets, the city lights blurring into streaks of amber and white across the windshield. My phone buzzed twice in the cup holder emails from the Pentagon program office, confirming my post-meeting assessment. I silenced it and kept driving. When I reached the hotel, I changed out of my uniform with ritual precision, hanging it carefully in the closet, smoothing the fabric under my palms. The silver eagle insignia glinted softly under the dim bedside lamp. For years, I believed wearing this uniform would finally make them proud. Today, I realized it didn't matter if it did or not. It made me proud. That was enough. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, staring at the carpet pattern under my boots. Images drifted through my mind in silent succession, Logan's faltering voice as he presented to me. My father's stunned silence as I corrected his most trusted director. Lorraine Hart shaking my hand with the respect of an equal. They were fragments of a victory I hadn't known I needed. Not revenge, not dominance, just proof that the person I had become was real. Unshakable, independent of their permission to exist. I lay back on the bed, the quilt scratchy against my arms, and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I slept without dreams. The next morning, the sun rose pale and soft through my hotel window. I checked out early, the lobby hushed and empty at dawn. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I drove past Westbridge one last time. The building loomed tall and silent in the early light, its mirrored windows reflecting a sky washed clean with morning calm. I didn't feel anger or triumph or regret. I felt free. On the drive back to the airport, I called my Pentagon program office to debrief. My voice was steady, precise, focused only on next steps. They updated me on upcoming strategy summits and DC final contract milestones and follow-on integration assessments. Copy all I said calmly. See you tomorrow at 0700. After I ended the call, I let silence fill the SUV. The highway stretched ahead in a long gray ribbon disappearing into the horizon. I felt my pulse settle into its mission rhythm again, quiet and certain. This was the road back. Not to who I was before, but to who I had always been becoming. I thought about my father, my mother Logan. I thought about how many years I spent believing I needed them to see me before I could see myself, and how wrong I had been, because the reward wasn't in their recognition. The reward was in every silent choice that built this life, choosing discipline over comfort, choosing service over validation, choosing presence over pride. I remembered Colonel Reyes's words spoken to me years ago in a sand-swept tent outside Kandahar. Worth isn't given, Dane. It's built, every mission, every failure, every decision, until no one can tear it down but you. The sun rose higher, spilling clean gold across the dashboard. As I merged onto the final stretch toward the airport, I felt something lift from my chest, a heaviness I hadn't known I carried dissolving into the brightening sky. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't driving away from something. I was driving toward everything I had already become. 6 months later, winter sunlight poured into my apartment, illuminating the clean white walls and dark wood floors with a quiet golden warmth. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Washington, D.C. sprawled in perfect order, the Potomac winding silver through pale stone monuments, the Pentagon's geometric vastness framed beyond the river. I stood in my kitchen sleeves rolled up as I arranged dinner plates along the oak dining table. The scent of roasted rosemary chicken and garlic potatoes filled the space with comforting gravity. My apartment was quiet but full-lined with dark bookshelves, framed citations, and sparse decorations chosen with deliberate calm. The only sounds were the ticking clock above the entryway and the faint hum of the oven timer. On one shelf rested my medals, bronze, silver, and navy blue tucked neatly beside cybersecurity textbooks, and a small black and white portrait of me in full uniform taken the day I pinned on Colonel. I hadn't displayed them to boast. I displayed them as reminders of what I built when no one was watching. The doorbell rang softly. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked to answer it. My father stood on the other side, bundled in a dark wool coat against the bitter January wind. In his hands, he held a large black frame wrapped in brown craft paper. For a moment, he just stood there looking at me with eyes that carried something I hadn't seen since childhood hesitation. I found this, he said, his voice low. Figured you might want a copy. He handed it to me. I peeled back the brown paper slowly to reveal a print feature from Defense Innovation Quarterly. The article headline read, "Colonel Juliet Dane, the quiet force behind Project Sentinel's success." At its center was a photograph of me in full dress uniform standing between General Armstrong and Lorraine Hart, both smiling proudly. I traced a gloved finger lightly over the glass. For a second, I didn't know what to say. It's been up in my office for a while now, he added awkwardly, eyes not quite meeting mine. Thought maybe it belonged here too. I looked up at him. The man who once told me the military was for people with no real options. The man who spent years believing my uniform was a symbol of wasted potential. In that moment, his gaze carried neither dominance nor dismissal, only quiet, faltering respect. "Thanks, Dad," I said softly. "It means something." He nodded once, clearing his throat roughly. "Smells good in here," he said, stepping inside. "Better than your mom's roast beef, anyway." A faint smile pulled at my lips. My mother arrived a few minutes later, cheeks flushed pink from the cold, cradling a steaming pie tin with both hands. "Apple?" she said, holding it out awkwardly. "Still your favorite, right? It is," I replied, taking it from her and placing it on the counter. She glanced around my apartment at the spotless countertops, the precise organization of books and framed commendations. "So clean, so put together," she said quietly, almost in awe. "I don't know how you keep it like this." Military habit, I almost joked, but I let the moment stay silent. She was trying. It didn't need commentary. Logan arrived last, with Mariel carrying a bottle of wine with a crisp white label and a sheepish smile that looked out of place on his otherwise confident face. "Hope this pairs well," he said, holding it out. "It will," I replied, taking it from him. Dinner felt different than it ever had growing up. Conversation drifted easily, punctuated by quiet praise and careful questions about my upcoming Pentagon briefings. My father listened more than he spoke. My mother laughed softly when I teased her about her pie crust being better than the Michelin star dessert I'd had in Dubai. After dishes were cleared and coffee poured, Logan pulled me aside near the balcony windows. The city sparkled behind him in a web of amber light. "I implemented the rollout structure you suggested," he said quietly. "The team didn't love it at first, but it works. Better than what we had." "Did you tell them where you got it?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He smirked faintly. "Eventually. After I let them believe I was a genius for about 5 minutes." I smiled, shaking my head. "As long as it's working." He paused, his expression softening into something I rarely saw in him: vulnerability. "It is. And so are you. I mean, you've really got it together." "I don't think I ever said that." "No," I said quietly, holding his gaze. "You didn't." He nodded once. "Well, I'm saying it now." Across the room, my father stood near the bookshelf, eyes scanning the medals arranged neatly beside framed cyber warfare commendations. His gaze paused on one, the cyber defense citation for counteracting a hostile breach that nearly crippled 2 federal networks. "I read about that one," he said quietly. "Didn't realize at the time you were leading it." "I was," I replied softly. He didn't say more. He just nodded, his eyes glinting faintly in the lamplight. It wasn't a parade, it wasn't a movie ending, but it was real, and that made it better. Later that night, as candles flickered low and coffee cups sat empty beside crumpled napkins, my father raised his glass in a quiet toast. To Colonel Juliet Dane, he said, his voice rough with unspoken emotion. "Who proved that worth isn't found in following someone else's path, but in walking your own?" Everyone raised their glasses. I looked around that room at the family who once told me I was wasting my potential, at the father who finally saw me as I was, at the brother who no longer measured me against his own reflection. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. The victory wasn't in their recognition. The victory was in knowing I would have kept going even if they never gave it. Because walking into that boardroom in uniform wasn't revenge, it was quiet clarity. I didn't need to explain who I was. My presence did that for me. They once told me I'd never become anything, and yet there I stood, leading the very project they built their careers on. That moment didn't heal everything. It didn't erase the past. But it did something better. It proved I never needed their blueprint to build my worth. So if they underestimate you, let them. Keep building. Keep rising. And when the moment comes, show up fully calmly. Because the strongest proof isn't what you say. It's who you've quietly become.